Oh God, I don't know. Yes, I mean not all of them stormed the Capitol building, but
That's right.
but they voted for him, so that's just as bad, almost.
We are talking about outcomes all the time, and I think we should clarify the concept. So the outcomes component comes after the immediate responses, which are mostly emotional and cognitive responses. And in the outcomes component, we also have affective and cognitive reactions, but those occurring after the initial response. So on the affective side, we have feelings of compassion or connectedness with other people, right? And on the cognitive side, it has been shown that inspiring media can elicit these kind world perceptions. So the idea that humanity is good in the grand scheme of things. But we also have other outcomes that your research has focused on. So what kind of outcomes can we expect on the motivational and behavioral side when people watch inspiring media, aside from political reactions now?
The main ones that have been explored are interconnectedness, feelings of interconnectedness with others, and altruistic motivations, and sometimes people have studied, actual behavior too. It could be just clicking a button saying that you're interested. It could be giving money to a charity. It could be helping the researcher pick up papers that she dropped all over the floor, So yeah, those are ones that are most commonly researched, I would say.
And can you see a gap between motivations and real behavior in the research?
Yeah, I mean, when you really get at real behavior,
Yeah.
and especially I would argue, most of the time we're studying these things right after viewing,
Yeah.
right? So, but the actual behavior, the effects are much less than they are in self-reported likelihood of doing it,
Yeah.
I would say. So how to actually translate motivation into concrete behavior is a big question and a good one.
And is there some research on that? Because I mean, it's important for non-governmental organizations who want to promote socially good behavior, right?
Right. There may exist something like that, but a lot. See, the thing is when we're talking about real behavior, then we're talking about longitudinal research, really, and which is needed. And there are only a handful of studies that have looked at like long-term effect. And by long-term, I'm talking just a couple weeks, you know. So long term, I don't know of a whole lot on that.
Okay, so that's mostly speculation then at this point.
That, I just wrote a review article on, and I would say, jury's out on that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So do you think, I mean, we are talking about booster shots now because we don't know how long the effects of vaccines will go. So for inspiring media, do the positive effects, do they come off, or do they go after 1 day or 1 week or even 1 month, or that's just something we don't know yet?
We don't really know. But it's interesting though, because let's say my goal was for you to get a vaccine, to convince someone to get a vaccine. Well, in that case, if I inspire you and you get the vaccine today, then I don't care if it's a long-term effect or not. Yeah.
Sure. And if I
Yeah.
already got one, I will probably also get the next one because
Yes.
now I have it.
Yeah. Right.
And okay, so we talked a lot about pro-social and positive outcomes, but you already alluded to the group around Diana Rieger, and they also propose some negative outcomes of inspiring media. So for example, Lena Frischlich published a content analysis in New Media and Society about dark inspiration and how Islamist extremist influences on Instagram use eudaimonic cues to drive people to commit to jihadist values. Menke and Wolf in Germany have demonstrated how the German right-wing populist party Alternative for Germany has strategically used nostalgia to support its populist claims. So inspiring media could be used for manipulation. Do you think this might pose a real threat?
Absolutely. I absolutely do. Yes, I love that direction of research, because a lot of politicians will use inspiring examples,
Yeah.
To elevating examples, and some of them, for really good ends. But I was looking back at the video of the US's former president, who cannot be named,
Yeah.
when Trump was giving his speech immediately before the insurrection. And, he was really trying to evoke inspiration and, I think, outrage at the same time.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
And so I think that is a very real issue that deserves. I'm just so glad people are looking at that and getting interested in that direction, because I think it's one that is you can see lots of examples of it. Yeah.
And I mean, for the example of the president who may not be named, it worked for almost 50% of the voting population, right?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know. Oh God, I don't know. Yes, I mean, not all of them stormed the Capitol building, but
That's right.
but they voted for him. So, but speaking of, like, harkening back to Kamamuta, they did an interesting study on it's called Crying Partisan Tears. I believe that's the title of the study, where they were looking at responses to politicians. This was Trump versus Hillary Clinton. So whether that translates into votes, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we are already at the topic of partiality and partisanship. So that may lead us to our feedback loops, the bracket that we opened earlier. So these feedback loops in your model, what exactly does that mean, that there is a feedback loop after watching an inspiring message? For example, the Kamamuta inducing message of that is partisan.
Yeah. Oh, that is partisan. Well, what we meant by feedback loops was that ultimately, so there's one feedback loop that goes from outcomes back to exposure. Okay, and by that, what we meant is that if I'm in, there's a couple of ways that this could operate, but if I am inspired by something, I may in turn seek out other inspiring content because I found that experience gratifying. So in that sense, I'm kind of building on my own library of inspiring stuff that I watch. But realistically, more than that, I think it's about the sharing with others. So I found this really inspiring, and so I'm going to post it on social media, something like that. The other thing that I would just say is another way that it can lead to exposure, the outcomes lead to exposure, is that I watch it, I experience this, and then algorithms follow me around and suggest that I view these kinds of things. So this is kind of a spiral. The other feedback loop is one that really we haven't, this is very speculative, okay? So this is a call, but just hearkening back to your questions about whether there are long-term effects. If there are, or if I become a heavy consumer of this kind of content, can that feed into and have long-term changes in terms of more stable situation, more stable? Can it change my personality? Can it make me have greater universality? Or if I'm inspired by, Obama videos, does that change my political orientation, ultimately? So those are long-term things. And I think they're worthy of investigation. We just don't have the data.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that would also be something to be researched in the future.
Yeah.
And now, do you think that eudaimonic entertainment or inspiring media could mold our perspective on issues like racial injustice or gender equality? Or is inspiring media just mirroring the societal currents that are already there? So do we have a heightened sensibility on issues like racial injustice, and that's what inspiring media will mirror, for example, new Netflix series? Or will inspiring media be the first one to tell us, hey, there is something going totally wrong in society, so act on that?
I think both can happen. And so, in one study that I did earlier on, so in another part of my research, in the past, especially, I've been very interested in racism and white racism toward African American men, usually. But when I got into this, I started thinking, look, usually efforts to counter any negative effect that media may have in increasing and contributing to these perceptions, any kind of effort to use media to counteract that has typically taken the person who's the target of racism and shown that person in a positive light. But I started thinking, if it's the case that exposure to meaningful media, elevating media, makes me feel closer with all humanity, then we wouldn't have to necessarily show one single race. We can just elicit elevation. It should it should contribute to that feeling of interconnectedness, and that should mean that we feel more connected with not just African Americans, but with immigrants, with a host of people who are stigmatized. So, and we found support for that in this example. So I think that it can work that way, but I also think that if I happen to feel that way, I'll find certain portrayals more moving than others.
Now, we talked a lot about the science behind inspiring media. Now we want to use a few examples. So what we would like to do now is for you to walk us quickly through the model again, but with a specific example. And I know that you really like this example and you like to show it during talks or presentations. The Thank You Mom commercial by Procter & Gamble being broadcasted during the Olympic Winter Games 2018.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter.
So a person is exposed to that, for example, by watching it in TV. What happens then when we go through the model again?
Okay, so they're exposed to it. It has a if they are empathic,
Yeah.
to begin with, they may feel, for example, much greater levels of elevation, and they may feel moved, choked up, and as a result, and particularly with that ad, because they're showing it's really touching on racism, kids who are bullied, homophobia, and so forth. And so I'm feeling that, and it makes me more concerned about these kids and who are disadvantaged. I may be inclined to want to volunteer be a big sister or something, I might seek more information about that. And I might share that video with others who respond similarly.
Now we're getting to the end, and we have some questions for future research. So for a big part, we have talked about the current state of research, which may need some addition. Now we want to take a look at the future. So media, race, and gender is also your field of research. We briefly introduced that. And we talked about the reduction of racial stereotype as another outcome of eudaimonic entertainment. Do you think it is important to outline this aspect even more in the future, especially because education on race and gender is heavily politicized in the US, right? So maybe media would be the way to educate people on these issues in the future when, for example, school education cannot deliver on that.
Yeah. No, I think that's really true. It's interesting though that I absolutely believe that's true. And I can imagine curricular activities that involve media, for example, that could be used to those ends. Most of the research, though, has looked at race reduction. I've looked, but I can't find how any research that's used this specifically to reduce negative attitudes related to gender. I just can't find it, Sexuality, yeah. So I don't, I think that's a really good question. Is it similar with gender? I'm not sure. I'm just not sure.
Another thing, there are studies on people watching horror films being more psychologically resilient during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I mean, we haven't talked about it yet, but it's always the elephant in the room. New variants are emerging all the time, and we cannot know how long COVID will be a big part of our lives. So the authors of this horror film study argue that, quote, exposure to frightening fictions allow audiences to practice effective coping strategies that can be beneficial in real world situations. Is inspiring media also able to remedy the crisis by being exposed to inspiring media?
There's so much research that's just coming out on that. We did one study on it early on during the pandemic before people were able to get vaccines. And we generally, the issue was wear a mask, because it's not just about protecting you, it's about protecting other people. And so we did find support for the idea that when people felt inspired, that heightened feeling of elevation was associated with greater tendency, willingness, more positive attitudes about mask wearing. In this particular study, though, we had roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans in the sample, and the effect was strongest for the Republicans. But that was really because almost we had a complete ceiling effect for the Dems. There wasn't much room for movement for them. But with Republicans, yeah.
So it promoted behaving well during the pandemic, also for people who would be on the political spectrum of maybe not behaving so well.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. I mean, that's also something NGOs or even governments could use, right?
I think it's a pretty powerful emotion when you feel it.
Yeah, sure.
Really.
Yeah. And in terms of recovery, so I mean, the crisis also hits people emotionally, right? More people probably are getting depressed because they don't have the contacts anymore they would have had normally. And can inspiring media promote emotional recovery after the crisis already hit a person hard in an emotional way?
That's a really good question. And my guess would be yes, that it could, namely because this elicitor that's common in a lot of media, one elicitor that's common is hope. Yeah. And so, I just in thinking of that literature, I can imagine that if one is suffering through this, having hope can be very, it can be very supportive for people. Yeah. So I think it could play an important, there's a whole interesting strand of research too on restorative journalism. And, I'm thinking about that. And this is largely looked at it in terms of, like, for example, if there's a natural disaster, a flood, something, stories about resilience can be very, have a strong positive outcome.
We talked about a lot of stuff that still has to be researched. If you had any means possible, like you could program in every programming language, you could do every R code for statistical analysis, and you had every research grant possible, what kind of I mean, that's a big dream, but what kind of study would you conduct?
Oh my God, that's a tough question. One thing that I would love to see more of is a physiological work, or during processing data collection. I think that would be fantastic thing to do. I would do, oh my God. I'm excited. I have all this money and time now, I would definitely try as much longitudinal research as I could, because a lot of your questions, and they're good ones, are, does it really have any effect in the long term? So I would love to do that. I would probably have a pretty good VR thing. Now I'm kind of getting curious about that. I would also want to continue to look at moral outrage and track voting behavior. Well, now that I'm the richest woman in the world. Yeah. But
it's still research grants. It's not Facebook.
But this is why we decided to put this model out there, because there's no way that one single person can do any of this, and we have a lot of questions, and we want for others to come and play with us if they're interested.
Now, as a last question for all our viewers who may not be researchers in the future, do you have one last tip for consuming meaningful media the right way, or some possible channels to follow on Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram, or something one has to keep in mind when searching for inspiring media?
Oh, well, what I would say, and this is what I was looking for, that you might find useful. I mean, there are lots and lots of feel-good channels, you know, and a lot of them are clickbait. Oh, get out your tissue, you know, you're gonna cry your eyes out, stuff like that. That can be a little sappy. I think a lot of really good research out there that you can find, and it's kind of a summary, if you go to Greater Good, and that can take you to a lot of, you know, great research that you can find. If you're just looking for videos, oh my God, they're just, I can't tell you how many hours I spent on YouTube, you know, like crying, you know. So, I mean, if you just type in moving commercial, you're going to find a lot.
But hopefully not the Pepsi commercial.
Yeah. Upworthy is a good one.
Okay, thank you. So I hope our viewers can take something from that. And I think we all can take something with us from this interview. So
well, thank you. And please, if you know anybody watches this and they're interested in it, drop me a note, and I'm interested in talking.
we leave your email in the and I don't know what this is called, the section under the video.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so yeah, with this interview sadly coming to an end, it's time for me to say thank you. Thank you to all our viewers, of course, who are watching this in front of a computer or laptop or handy screen, probably during a pandemic. And I really hope you have learned something through this interview. And also thank you so much to our today's guest, Mary Beth Oliver. It really was an honor to have you here as our guest, and it really was a pleasure talking to you.
It was great being here. Thank you for the invitation. Really appreciate it. And I hope that we continue to stay in touch.